Good afternoon, everyone. It's Blair McPherson speaking. Thank you to the IR Society for hosting this IR webinar on digital IR engagement with investors. We'd also like to acknowledge sponsor of this event, Orange Capital. Thank you very much for sponsoring this event. It should be a good chat amongst our group of people we have on the call today. As way of introduction, we have myself, Blair McPherson, founder and CEO of Senasen, Elena Prentice, Investor Relations and ESG Manager at Rolls-Royce, Stuart Fieldhouse, Director at Hawksmoor Partners, Julian Smith, Managing Director at BRR Media. And I think the topic's very interesting, and the participants on this call have experience in different areas of the marketplace, which I think is very important to bring these different groups together, buy side, sell side, service providers, to have a meaningful dialogue on the topic of digital investor relations. It can mean different things to different people, both from a perspective of audiences, different channels, and content. We will be taking questions through the session today that may last up to an hour. We'll see how we get on. We'll try to leave most of the questions to the end because perhaps some of the questions will be answered throughout the dialogue, as there's a lot of crossover in the content within the discussion. But this will be a fluid conversation amongst the four participants I had mentioned. So a little bit more detail on the discussion topics. Investor types and audiences. I think this is critical from a perspective of who we're trying to engage with, how they are different. Financial services markets is a large industry and ecosystem, which over time has tended to be siloed in different buckets due to intermediation, where some practices have been kept separate, whether that's talking about fund marketing, investor relations for public companies, investor relations for private companies of different sizes, just different investor types, whether it's private investors, professional investors, and intermediaries in between that serve these different constituents. And when we get into the digital world, those barriers fall down quite quickly, which we're seeing and we'll talk about. Beyond those kind of institutional groups that I just mentioned, certainly demographically, and if you look at the wealth transfer that's going to be happening over the coming years to Generation X and the millennials, they have a completely different way to engage socially and certainly in work, which is really driven from technology. So we'll get into those points later on as well. Digital channel options. What are they? What work well and why, and what doesn't work well and why? This is a fascinating component, knowing that a lot of the digital options available today have grown from a social environment, specifically in the social media space, that businesses are now trying to use it for business purposes. And you get into the areas of compliance, get some of the challenges, some of the platforms around antisocial behavior, the way they're designed. So how are people managing those channels effectively within the framework that their organization, from both a brand and compliance perspective, are working towards. And finally, types of content and interaction used via the digital channels. Content is king. It is part of the medium. It's not just a channel, but it's the way in which it's delivered. Going back to the reference on demographics, video does lead the future. It is that type of engagement. That's why socially YouTube is very popular. People want to consume information and knowledge via video. I love to read, and I have children, but I must say that they tend to lead to video first over reading things. Hopefully that stabilizes, but certainly you need a combination of both to get the proper engagement, which really brings in the art of storytelling. We used to do it very well in pubs, telling a story. When you have a conversation, how are people telling the stories, both in written form and via video? is very important, especially in a controlled environment on dissemination of information, financial information that can be sensitive to the market, whilst also give you insight to what's going on to a company, not just on the story of a financial result, but as important of what is the story of the product and services that are being produced and delivered to the marketplace, and bringing those components together cohesively. So with that, as a bit of a summary, I would like to hand over to Julian from BRR Media, who's kindly put a couple of slides together to put some thoughts and framework around the agenda, and we'll begin the conversation. Julian, over to you.
Great, thanks, Blair, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'd just like to make a couple of introductory remarks which pick up to some extent on some of the themes that Blair was outlining there. Very briefly, what we spend each and every working day is just thinking about the many different ways in which we can help companies to create content which is consumed online via a number of different devices and platforms. So for us, it's we recognise there is a trend here. If you just look at this particular this slide here, it shows how much IP traffic is growing. By 2020, Cisco reckons there'll be 4.8 zettabytes of data consumed in IP traffic per year. Just to give you a sense for what that means, that is a 1 with 21 zeros after it of bytes being consumed. So there's a huge amount of growth in traffic, and video is responsible for a very large chunk of it. It goes up from 73% of traffic in 2017 to 82% by 2022. So a huge amount of video being consumed. There's a lot of bad video out there as well, which might go to something that we talk about later on in terms of the quality of the narrative. But also just the number of devices that are out in the market and the way people can consume it. We have more than 3 times the global population in terms of number of devices that are expected to exist from an IP perspective. So mobiles, tablets, obviously the laptops, the desktops, and potentially other forms too. So we see a huge continuation of the trend that we've all been witnessing and using both in work and outside of work over the next sort of 5 years. Perhaps bring it more closely now to the IR world, making it more relevant to that. If we just think for a moment about what those consumer trends have done, I think we may have gone too far. Let me just come back. Okay, so we've bear with me a moment. So we've witnessed a huge amount of growth in OTT traffic. So people consuming non-linear TV. They will watch a YouTube video when they want to. They will watch something on Instagram. They will go on to Netflix, and this is just changing the behaviour as a consumer. Certainly, my children now watch the majority of their video content actually on their mobile device and not on a television at all. It's facilitated by the availability of broadband in offices, outside of offices, at home. So this is changing the ability, the ease for people to consume content. At the same time, there's been a pretty significant shift that is underway, principally as a result of MiFID II, but other pressures and regulatory changes in the investment world. And we are seeing, and I'm sure the ROs on the phone will have witnessed the changes in the way that the research houses of their brokers or the banks that they know particularly well have changed their business models, the way they distribute the written research, the way they try to monetize the value of airtime with the buy side. And what this is leading to, we believe, is a much greater focus and concentration upon the most important investors or customers to the different research houses. Some of them will be able to keep a more of a waterfront coverage, but others will not. And sure, there are exemptions for brokers being able to set up roadshows, but in terms of where the real quality of relationships lie, it's becoming more, I guess, problematic. There is less alignment between the company, the research analyst, the sales guy, the trader, and that all flowing through the same intermediary. This is now breaking up, and what that means is there's more onus, I think, on the company to have a communication policy that addresses the different needs of the different constituents of the investor base. And that's so on the, there is a very, certainly for FTSE 350 companies and definitely in the FTSE 100, very, very diverse and broad international range of investors now in UK companies. It's one of the most international markets, London. But your brokers will be focused on looking after the top, let's say, 50 investors, because that's where the, I guess, available share of wallets would be for them. And then you have a much longer tail of what you might call smaller, underserved institutional investors, and you need to think, well, okay, so how do we fill in those gaps? Because it's not necessarily the case that these guys would be picked up on the post-results roadshows, because they wouldn't be that important, but they still are interested in your story. And then again, taking it down to the next level, you've obviously got the private investor community. I think my sense is that companies are more cognizant of the need to be transparent and be more equal, perhaps, than was the case previously, and making information available on a timely basis. So those are sort of some of the, I guess, the themes that we are seeing impacting the strategies that IROs today are thinking about as they look to develop and iterate their own communication, their online communications plan from an investor relations perspective. I think what might be quite handy is if I pause at that point. I don't know if there's any observations from any of the other panelists who want to sort of chime in before perhaps picking up some other points later on.
Great. Thank you, Julian. That was a good discussion on key trends and drivers. I'd be interested from Stuart and Helena, Stuart specifically from the buy side. We use investors. Obviously, on the buy side, you're talking about marketing funds. But they're the same people. People buy shares, people buy funds. What do you find same, similar challenges, trends on the fund marketing side?
Fund marketing is quite a difficult beast, because it really depends on the type of fund you're marketing and whether you're going after the end retail investor or whether you're principally selling to the institutional market. Basically, if you managers who are running institutional money and have clearly defined institutional vehicles, they're the ones who are addressing quite a small number of stakeholders, and these stakeholders they frequently communicate with directly. And this is a market that's still, I have to say, quite behind the curve when it comes to digital communications. Many of them are still receiving PDFs or emails from funds. And where I see the real advantage is going to be for asset managers, is specifically going to be the retail market going forward. We've already mentioned the millennials on this discussion. A lot of the wealth management and the IFA community are selling funds that are big brand managers, funds that typically are, I would say, in the current environment, slightly overpriced and also underperforming the indexes they're meant to be outperforming. You're seeing the millennial generation now focusing very much on passive funds, on index trackers, but certainly if you look at the UK, there's a big education piece that still needs to be made, and I think we're starting to see digital media like video being used now to educate people more. You hear the FCA in the UK and some other regulators banging on about how more should be done by the product providers to educate the end investor. So it's less about just we have a new portfolio manager or we beat our index by 2% last year. The private investor wants to know a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of the product, what makes you special, why they should be putting their savings, which they've worked so hard to build up, why they should be entrusting it to you. That's really the message that I think a lot of asset managers are still missing out on, to be honest with you, or they're relying on intermediaries or broker platforms to do this for them. And I still think that's a job that's not being done well. And I think digital media is just beginning to be used a little bit more effectively in that respect.
Yeah, it's interesting. I find, coming from the buy side, is the same types of themes around on communication. Are you communicating advice? Is it education? Is it a sales channel? And the appropriate content to put on those different channels, whether it's digital or not. But the democracy, which I think Julian had referenced, not using that nomenclature, of how do you communicate equally amongst a large pension fund, or I should say more of a smaller pension fund that might be invested in a UCITS fund in Dublin or Luxembourg, to a retail investor who only has, say, 50,000 euros in the fund. They have different access to information, different engagement, and this is where video comes in from a fund manager's perspective, where an end investor can actually see what her portfolio manager looks like, can engage to Q&A and share information, get a little bit more tangible human factors. And I would say on the corporate side, just as a fund manager is analyzing companies, wants that engagement with a CFO, a CEO, or a product manager to understand what they're actually building or making. That two-way engagement to make things more efficient is certainly what digital brings to the marketplace across all these different sectors of financial services. But I suppose, Elena, I might ask you to make some comments, knowing that Rolls-Royce has done a lot of work in this area and really leading kind of in this industry in the digital applications.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've worked really hard to revamp our website in the last year or so, and really trying to encourage people to our website as the main source of information. We don't currently do much video content on our IR section, but our communications team and our HR team do a fantastic job at video content for new employees and our customers and things like that. But video content for the IR section of the website is certainly something that we're looking to improve on. And we actually had a conversation this week about it with senior management as a sort of next step for how to improve our website. Okay,
great, Helena. I might ask you one more question before I pass back on to Julian to go through his next area. Is obviously there's one is content, content being whether it's video or documents or commentary. The other is interaction, and how comfortable organizations are on the interaction around that content, meaning whether it's messaging, controlling a commentary area, Q&A sessions. And Julian, maybe I'll use that as a lead-in as you go into your next section around content plus interaction and your views on what you're seeing in the marketplace and what's needed.
Yeah, I think definitely the website again is our source of interaction with both the buy side and the sell side. We make sure our contact details are there in case people want to get in touch, because people are certainly coming to us more so now post MiFID. I think there's definitely a drive to come to us directly. And around results days, for example, we do have a live video webcast where people can pose questions, so there is that interaction there as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before I hand it over to Julian, is everyone is probably aware of Jonathan Kay's paper that he wrote in 2012 for the UK government on the lack of engagement between companies and investors, and really they're talking about the smaller investors. So that's 7 years ago now, but slowly, but surely, because of some of these digital tools, it's actually being applied. Julian, I'll pass back over to you.
Sure, thanks, Blair. So just picking up on that and starting to think a little bit more about the content itself. There are 2 or 3 features that we think are very important to bear in mind as you are looking to create the content. And the first one being currency. It's all about getting the timing right. There is no point, Ellen and the management team putting the RNS out at 7 a.m. on a Thursday in March, whatever it might be, and then having a webcast 2 weeks later, because all of the information, all of the narrative, all of the agenda will have been set you know, 2 weeks prior. So if you're going to produce any kind of content that is timely around results or around a particular event, it could be a big, you know, a big M&A deal. You want to make sure that you've got that out on a very, very timely basis, following the formal communication. Obviously, nothing can go out beforehand, and everything is strictly sort of embargoed, even if it's sort of pre-recorded under NDNA. But it's possible to do that and make sure that you make it available. So we would typically have a number of companies that would do the RNS at 7 a.m. A live audio video webcast of the results presentation, which would be interactive to some degree, and you can take questions in the room. You can take questions over a telephone call from analysts that can't participate, and you can also facilitate questions across the webcast itself. It does make it a little bit more, I guess, more things for the management team to handle, for the chairman to moderate, but it is technically absolutely feasible to do that. And then quite often we would have like maybe a video interview that would be published around the time that the analyst meeting would finish. So maybe around 10:30, you would have a video interview that would pop up onto the company's website and other sort of social media channels if they use them. So currency really important. Consistency, absolutely critical. You need to think about everything hanging off of the formal communication. So the RNS is obviously the foundation upon which everything is built, but then you have the ability to tell the story in a manner that is consistent with the facts that are in there. Nobody's going to thank you for producing a very, very sort of one-eyed account of a set of results in a video interview if it's entirely inconsistent with what you've communicated elsewhere. So you've got to just make sure that you're balanced, you're addressing the real issues of the day, and you sort of bear that in mind as you go through. And then creativity is a function of how much time and cost do you want to sort of take on board in order to create the content. If you're recording something before a results presentation, you're probably a little bit more restricted in the time that is available to do something very, very creative. And that isn't really the focus. But if we were preparing a corporate video, it would typically be a sort of a 2 to 3 month project, and we would think about where we would go out to film the content first and what the different shots that would be selected would be. We'd use a range of different techniques. You might include drones, you may have some animated overlays, but what you would do is you would increase the production value of the content, which would have more impact on the audience as they watch it. You might only end up with a 5-minute bit of content, which wouldn't be fundamentally similar to the video interview, but the way it's put together and the way it tells a story is much more engaging to the audience. And typically those sorts of content we see as being, having a longer shelf life than the 6 months that, say, a video interview would last on the back of a set of results. So currency, consistency, and creativity are critical. And to your point in the original opening remarks, Blair, the narrative is very important. Thinking about the way it is coming across. Most investors, in number terms, obviously not in percentage ownership terms, don't actually get to sit down face to face and eyeball the CEO. So to the extent that they are given the opportunity to do that in some sort of video content, it gets them that much closer. They can see the body language, the manner in which the points are made, the level of confidence in the delivery. That all helps to create something that is more engaging and therefore more powerful at communicating the messages.
Great, Julian. Thanks for the 3 C's. I like that framework. Stuart, I know you had something you want to contribute.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Basically, we're in a situation now at the moment where you mentioned the analysts just now. The analysts are now focusing more and more on just a smaller number of companies. So you've now got a situation where there are quite a lot of companies out there that are really being under-researched, and there is very little information out there about them. I was talking to the guys at the Armchair Trader last week, and they were saying you can easily tell from their traffic figures which are the companies which have a large quantity of retail investors in them, and where the serious retail interest is. And it's always with the big brand names. And you can mention a company like Rolls-Royce, for example. That's got a great brand. It's got great public awareness. Yet there are other companies out there where there's very little public awareness, very little understanding. And then once you move out of the FTSE 350, you move into an area where there's maybe 1, maybe 2 analysts looking at that company, maybe none. if a journalist wants to write a story about it, frequently there's very little information out there already. So for companies like that, something like the tools that have already been mentioned here, I think that's really essential, because otherwise there's very little messaging that a journalist or a retail investor can actually find out about you, and you're really flying under the radar.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Stuart. And just on content, I'll just add from a personal perspective, but certainly colleagues over the years, being a private investor and from a professional investor, we really like to know about a business is the product and services. I'll keep going back to that. There's lots of places to get financial information. I can get them from Bloomberg, I can get them from analysts, but what's really engaging content is, great, let's lift up the hood on your financial viability and prospects to make a return. But what do you actually produce? You make a site tour of your factory or your mine or a new commercial of a shoe you brought out. That is powerful and quite sticky and engaging and emotional. Fund managers love to hear about the products, what new technology is coming on. Now, historically, these departments within organizations have been separated. The marketing team don't tend to be too close to the IR team. It's a generalization. And they're both creating content, different content, and it's never brought together in one place. It tends to be very siloed. So that richness of content that's already being produced, bring it together to then engage with an investor audience of different types is very important. The other thing I'd mention, going back to investor types, it's not just investor types, it's company types. And we're touching on a little bit through whether it's MiFID II and the impact on small caps and lack of analysts covering certain sectors. Having counted banks, I know how many analysts have left. The other component, though, is obviously private companies, because again, I like to bring back investor relations is not just about public companies. It's about the fund market. It's about private companies across disciplines. And if you're a startup company, telling your story in a mobile via video can be just as powerful than having a big production set up. So, it is horses for courses, but it's the same type of digital tools that can be leveraged depending upon what your budgets are. And on the content side, there's a wealth of content that's trapped in organizations that's never brought the attention of all participants. On that note, Helena, what are your thoughts specifically on your experience digitally of working with or trying to communicate and engage with different investor types? What are your thoughts of challenges or opportunities?
I think there is recently sort of more of a demand for people wanting to get information quickly, and I think there's always been that demand, but recently it's become even more so. And so as part of that, really trying to build our website, trying to make it as clear to navigate as possible has been very important. Video content, I think, is a fantastic way of having that engagement as well, like you mentioned earlier, Julian. And also, I think up to now we've been pretty conservative in terms of social media, but there has been quite a lot of talk about that and how other companies have used social media to their advantage.
Great, thank you, Helena. I'll pass on to Julian, who I know wants to go through kind of the different internal hierarchy of needs, and also I would like to touch on the social media aspect and the challenges around that, around antisocial behavior, impacts on brands, the compliance features that don't exist. So how are they really being used in kind of financial promotion or investor relations? But I'll hand over to Julian to carry on, if that's all right.
Sure, thanks. Actually, just perhaps a quick follow-on for Elena before I carry on with a couple of slides. Do you guys think about the retail community as distinct from any other sort of bucket of investor? And by that I mean I know that they can access the analyst meeting webcast and that sort of thing. But do you seek to engage with them directly in any way, or is that something that has not been a priority so far at Rolls-Royce? And then perhaps secondly, the other question I was going to say is, do you see think about your ESG hat for a moment, do you use multimedia or video as a way of getting across the company's culture and policies with regard to ESG? We know it's been growing in importance in the minds of investors, and I just wonder whether, from the internal Rolls-Royce perspective, is that something that you think about?
Sure. So just taking the ESG point first of all, we do take it very seriously at Rolls-Royce. We have got a sort of dedicated sustainability section on the website. What we haven't done is create a separate ESG section on our IR pages, because we feel it is part of Rolls-Royce as a whole. It's not just a sort of IR-specific topic. So that's a conscious decision there to have it throughout the website, but also have a separate sustainability section. In terms of retail investors, I wouldn't say we address them separately. I think we take quite a general approach to all our investors. I think that's fair, and I think that's pretty common for a lot of companies like Rolls-Royce.
Yeah, super, thank you. So just move, if I can then turn it on to, I guess, the hierarchy of digital IR needs, with apologies to Maslow for completely ripping off his chart here, if anybody recognises that. Let me just see if it's going to come up. Okay, so from our perspective, there are some bits of digital content that we would regard as being more fundamental and more important. And as you go up towards the sort of pointy end of the triangle, they are what we would say, I guess, a bit more optional, depending on the type of company, whether it makes sense, depending on the importance, the budget, and various other bits and pieces. But these days, it is not very expensive, and we think it is pretty important for any company, and actually this goes to a large extent for private companies as well as public companies that want to have a public profile, something that just sets out the stall, a bit like an introductory investor presentation. What is the company all about? What is the business strategy, and who's the team that's going to deliver it effectively? So it's not something that needs to be renewed every 6 months, every year. It could probably last for 2 to 3 years on a company's website. So once you've made that investment, the return on it, because it's normally got a pretty high profile on the website, it will tend to get watched quite a bit, because people are drawn to watching video if it is there to be seen. Stepping up, you've just got the results webcast. We think that's very good practice, and more companies. Used to be the case sort of 3-4 years ago that 85% of the FTSE 100 would put out some sort of webcast, be video or audio with the results, but only 45% of the FTSE 250 would do that. We see that there's been quite a bit of growth in the 250 space, with management teams either on their own or through the advice from their financial PRs and their brokers, deciding that it is the right thing to do to have that available. I think CEO interviews, we see quite a lot of those. We think it's a very helpful way the company can try to set out the agenda for the day's results, and that is helpful for investors, but also for maybe the press that are not going to get to speak to the management team. And then we start to get a little bit more creative towards the top end of the triangle with thematic videos. And again, we're sort of thinking here, you could expose one particular part of the business that isn't that well understood. So you could have a focus bit there. You might be able to go and get some customer testimonials if it's relevant to do that, to provide a bit of third party, I guess, proof about the way the business is interacting with its customer base. Or it could be something to do with the company's policy. So we do see more and more sort of ESG videos that maybe look at some case studies of where the company is putting its policies into practice, and working with different communities or working in certain ways. So we see that sort of more and more. And then at the top end, we're starting to see some 360 videos. In fact, we're just down in Cape Town at the moment, filming over the next, yesterday and today, about 70 different interviews with mining company CEOs. We've also got a recently produced 360 video of a mine site visit in Turkey, where you effectively allow the user to put on a set of VR goggles and to look around the mine, and they can elect effectively where to go next, and the video that they're watching is not only in 360 but it's also animated, so you can get additional rich bits of information communicated at the same time. So it's a much more immersive experience. It's not a one-to-many because it's best experienced through the goggles, but it's quite powerful when you put them on, to be taken without having to get the airfare or get approval from your compliance team, to go, literally be transported straight there to the mine site. So for certain types of companies that have assets in difficult places to get, where they want to actually bring them back to the investor, wherever the investor may be, we start to see that being used a bit more, and there's a lot of flexibility to grow and do different things with that. So again, perhaps there, just sort of take a pause and see if there's any other thoughts in terms of different content or points that people would like to make.
Great, thanks, Julian. I like the 360 of the mine. I'd love to see that. I'll pass over to Stuart to make comments.
Yeah, I was just basically to add to that. I think one of the important elements of IR is sort of the new digital age that we're talking about here is, if you are the sort of company that, talking about the mining sector, for example, but we also see this a little bit in the fund sector, and we've done some work with funds in this area. If you're the sort of company that thinks, and we still see this, we don't need to say anything, we're doing quite well, thank you very much. We don't need to communicate. We know who our stakeholders are. That's all well and good, but we're now living in an environment where you therefore leave the stage to other people. And we see this a lot in America, where you have activist hedge funds who can quickly take over the narrative around a particular company, and before the CEO knows it, there's a huge debate going on about his business, and it's being led by other people. And this is something that digital environment allows people to do a lot more than they were able to do previously. Previously, if you go back 20, 25 years, they had to find a friendly journalist. Now they can get online, they can get on Twitter, and before you know it, you've lost control of the narrative around your business. And we see it with mining companies, we see it with a lot of listed companies as well, and it comes from a more sort of cautious, conservative culture where they'll look at things like video and social media and just say, oh, well, we've never done it this way, and we've always done it sometimes a different way, and that's always worked in the past. And then when they get caught out, it's already too late. And I think it's important, even if you're not already engaging, just keep your eyes and ears open and start monitoring what's being said about you. You'll be surprised frequently how much is already being said.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and it leads into Gillian's next slide, which I find interesting discussion on distribution. And Gillian will reference the channels website as well, which I kind of use different nomenclature around networks that grew up as social, and within that, what are the impacts of that around control? Control is critical, and are these channels fit for purpose for this type of information and this targeted user type? And company websites around being a repository and an engagement mechanism. But I don't want to jump into Julian's slide. He made it, I didn't, so I'll let him speak, then we'll make comments. Sorry, Julian.
Very good, thank you. So yeah, let me perhaps just start in the middle. The core shop window for any company is its website. Whether that's from a careers perspective, it's from an investor perspective, it's from a regulatory perspective even. It's fundamental, and 100. The beauty is you have 100% control over there. What is on it, how frequently it's updated, and how you present it in the best way possible. Then there are what we kind of regard as separate channels, and perhaps some of these more social channels are more they're owned by the company, but clearly they're on a platform which is free and open. As we just had discussion, various people can feel free to sort of write whatever they want about companies on things like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. So we would say we see a lot more companies going to Twitter, and you can produce some quite good content that is largely amplifying the regular content that you're putting out anyway, but is putting it down that channel in an equal way. I think the difficulties come when you start wanting to get into a debate on Twitter. I think that's probably quite a risky area from a controls perspective. Some companies have clearly much more public profiles from a general social media standpoint. So I haven't gone back, but just imagine the sort of amount of traffic around VW on the back of the emissions scandal there. Well, obviously that's a totally different side of things, but it's something that you, from an IR perspective, I just need to be sort of cognizant of. We think most companies who want to do this properly will have their own IR section, which will be completely distinct from the perhaps the main sort of corporate or the brand or the public-facing side of the company on Twitter. Facebook, we're not entirely convinced it is a natural for sort of IR content. I do know one or two companies that have said actually they get great engagement from the videos that they put up on Facebook, which are more kind of corporate IR in their nature, just helping to sort of regularly inform and update people on the sorts of things they're doing. I'm not sure personally, but maybe it's horses for courses depending on the type of company and the type of people who are interested in it. LinkedIn, we do use that ourselves from time to time, and we do see companies sort of again embracing that. It does slightly again depend sort of by nature of the company. Instagram probably a little bit more consumer and fashion related. We see that as being more of a channel for telling sort of behind the scenes stories a little bit for companies that want to perhaps engage more with their kind of employee base and more of that side of things than specifically for an IR channel. And then perhaps just a sort of one very brief comment about third-party channels. The debate about the company is happening all over the place in terms of online world, and we know that people do homework on things like Stockopedia or Interactive Investor before investing in companies, and they have a lot of information there, which is about your financials, about the news, and we're pushing down some media content into these channels so that people can access that relevant digital content whilst they're already on that particular site. Some sites also have chat forums and this sort of thing, and financial PRs will be able to sort of advise you more on that to the extent that there is discussion about your stock on there, but it's probably slightly tricky area to start engaging in because not meaning to sound too pejorative, but there is a grubbier end of the smaller, more speculative retail investment market that I would suggest perhaps from time to time get up to all sorts of postings which are perhaps not in the best interest of the company, and they're looking to sort of push a particular angle of their own. So some of those parts of the market, I would sort of tread very, very carefully around those. But as time goes on, I would expect more and more companies to sort of embrace things like Twitter, certainly, but maybe a little bit of LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. And I'm probably a little biased given the fact that I founded a company. It's a technology company to be in addition to or eventually replace some of these Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook channels for an investment community and business community, but really around Stuart's points around control and focus to your audience. I agree on the third-party channels. It's interesting because it's a big world out there. And demographics have changed. I'm always interested on reach, on how do you reach growing demographics, growing middle classes in India, and Asia proper, and obviously, Julian, you travel the world, and again, a lot of these channels tend to be very domestic or niche. I suppose that is the beauty of kind of the social networks of it having global reach. Unfortunately, you get that lack of control sometimes. Elena, maybe ask you to make comment on perhaps on the company website around driving traffic and eyes onto your website that you spend a lot of time building. What are some of your methodologies or behaviors or culture around getting more views and engagement?
So I do monitor our Google Analytics quite closely just to see who is coming to our website and how effective our IR section is. I think that's quite a helpful tool, and you can also check your sort of bounce rates and those sort of things. In terms of this slide here and company channels, etc., I mean, like I said earlier, we do use LinkedIn quite a lot, but that is mainly from an HR communications sort of corporate messaging perspective rather than an IR channel per se.
Okay, great. Stuart, I know you do a lot of work in the buy side on digital channels. What are your views or thoughts, especially coming from the Financial Times as well? You've worked there. So.
I mean, certainly, if you look at the media, I know that a lot of journalists who I speak to use Twitter extensively and at LinkedIn as well. Not just to get announcements from companies, but going back to my earlier point, there are a lot of commentators out there in the digital space who are considered credible. I mean, there are lots who aren't, but there are some, and even amongst hedge funds, they will follow Twitter and they will keep tabs on what is going on in the digital sphere. And I know, for example, some very big hedge funds that I'm not going to mention on this call who are using technology to monitor multiple platforms for any kind of signals that might change commodity prices, for example. I know of an instance where one took quite a large position based off chatter that was going on around one of the mining companies in South America. And it's that kind of information that is becoming more and more important to fund managers. It's not just the analysts' calls or the data that's coming out of the companies themselves. It's what's going on around them outside of formal media like the FT or Bloomberg. There are lots of more sort of smaller niche observers and commentators out there who are regularly posting on social media and other forums who have accumulated credibility over the years, and these guys now enjoy quite a lot of influence and leverage.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, and kind of way the industry is structured. You know, we tend to focus, okay, but the CEO's message, the CFO's message, and been the buy side and the expert networks where they look for people who know the nuts and bolts about something in an industry. Most investors are more interested in who's the product manager, who's their technology person, where they can get their thoughts through social media, what they're doing personally. I mean, it's amazing the data that's captured. Yeah. That gives them a feeling of what's really going on in an organization. So there are no surprises, or you have information other people don't. So it's an interesting, it's not all siloed in around a reporting structure and what the top of the C-suite says. It is how they're engaging with the whole organization.
And you see it particularly in the tech space now. I mean, the West Coast tech companies, some of them like Google. Yeah. Important informal product announcements come out from Google on for example, Twitter, which Google followers pick up on straight away, outside of their normal formal corporate announcements. Yeah.
So I'm just conscious of time. It's been 15 minutes. I do encourage anyone who's on the call to post any questions on the webinar. Whilst you do that, I'll try to feed them in, but perhaps just some closing remarks. And maybe I'll start with Helena just on some of our topics, then I'll pass off to Julian and Stuart. Elena, anything you'd like to kind of summarize or bring to people's attention?
I think it's just quite an exciting time. There are so many different options now, ways to communicate better with investors, also with the sell side, and I'm just quite excited to see how it's all going to evolve really, and how best practice in terms of investor relations is also going to evolve. There's certainly more that we can do, and I hope at Rolls-Royce we can embrace some of these new communications channels. But for now, I think we've improved our communications, and look forward to the future.
Great, Elena. Julian, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think that perhaps the last thought to leave with people is there's a lot that is possible but it's actually more important to understand, based on the type of company you are and the profile that you want to have, what is the right balance of bits of content and indeed channels, just to make sure you get it right and you do something which works for the executive and indeed the non-executive. So it's just about, it's a little bit horses for courses, but there's it's definitely an area worth exploring, and because the technical and the technological opportunities are quite broad and varied now. So we'll continue to expect to see that innovate over the next few years.
Great, Julian. While I have you here, we do have a question, and I'll read you the question. A video can take a notoriously long time to film and edit. Do you see any new approaches for shortcutting the time and money in making traditional corporate videos? Your area of expertise, Julian, so do you mind addressing that?
Sure. Well, I did mention that we're shooting somewhere between 70 and 80 video interviews whilst we're down here in Cape Town through yesterday and today. We're actually filming those on an iPad and with wired microphones. So we've cut back on the production value in order to assure speed of turnaround and also ease of editing. So we can put a branded sting on the front and at the back, very minimal, if any, editing in through the video itself, and they can be available within, if we sat down and did them, we could make them available, each one within sort of 10 to 15 minutes. So there are, depending on how important your turnarounds are and how much complexity you want to put into it, because what adds the time is the complexity. So if you have to go to 5 different locations to film a corporate video around the country, and you're bringing a lot of footage back, that's going to take a bit longer to edit. But if we wanted to do a video interview with the CEO at 5 o'clock before the results at 7 a.m. the next day, and there's already some images or some video footage that exists before we do that, we can film the video interview, we can integrate that content very, very quickly, and we'll have it available and ready for the next day, and it's for the time of the results announcement at 7 a.m. effectively. So it is possible to do things these days on a much faster turnaround. So just those are the sort of 2 things to kind of bear in mind.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Julian. I think that covered it well. We'll take one more question with regards to how best should a presentation be prepared for investors and analysts, which I suppose it depends on what type of investor and what sector. What will investors like to see in corporate results presentations? Elena, maybe from your perspective of not only perhaps content, but the way in which it's presented, what's your view on the presentation of results?
That's quite a wide question, that. I'd probably say the key thing...
Just your top 1 or 2 tips would be good.
Yeah, I guess the key point would be just making sure you have a good structure. Often we have an introduction by a CEO, a deeper discussion from our CFO, and then a wrap-up again by our CEO, and I think that works well as a general structure. I'm happy to take that up after the call if you want to get a bit more colour.
That's broad. It's probably my fault not to frame it properly. Stuart, final thoughts?
I think final thoughts are, for me anyway, is have a story to tell, basically. At the end of the day, many companies do have a lot of interesting things to talk about, and a lot of that doesn't come out frequently in the presentations that you might see. I was a journalist for 11 years, and I used to go in and interview some fund managers whose, on the surface of it, their funds would seem very dry and uninteresting. But once you were sitting in a room with them and they got talking about it, it was actually much more fascinating than they came across initially. And I think these new media tools that are becoming available allow you to tell stories in a much better way than you might have been able to do 15 years ago. Even if you're in a really technical space like biotech or life sciences or some sort of industrial technology, there's still an interesting story there that investors want to hear about other than just the numbers that they're going to see. And you need to really be able to supplement those numbers with other media and with just the composition of an interesting story.
Great. Just very quickly, my final thought is, everyone's in an same ecosystem. There is a lot of intermediation in the marketplace of people working in silos, but whether you're buy side, sell side, your company allocating capital, your fund allocating capital, everyone has investors that they want to engage with, can be the same investor. And so a lot of these digital tools is bringing a little bit of a democracy and access to the ecosystem, because every investor is important, whether small retail or large sovereign wealth fund. So what I'm really excited about in the digital world is bringing access and optionality and in time control for the great content that Julian's firm would create, as an example, to bring more engagement and more human aspects to the conversation, specifically around, even within an organization, getting away from it just being IR's responsibility to tell the story. There's a lot of great content and storytellers in their product groups and marketing groups that can supplement the IR information and channels to round out the holistic value proposition of a company of why buy me or why hold on to me, and getting away from market chat of what's the price of my stock today, which drives me nuts as a long-term investor. So with that, I would like to conclude. I'd like to thank very much to our contributors. I'm just going to move to a task of highlighting the upcoming events in a moment. So upcoming IR Society events, February 27th, IR Networking, Gin Tasting. I'm from Chiswick, so I suggest the Sipsmith gin. It's quite nice. March 21st, IR Breakfast Best Practice Awards launch. April 25th, IR Masterclass. And May 16th, IR Networking Hub Night. Sounds like fun. So thank you all, and we're pretty much right on time. So everyone have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, everyone.